Thank you so much. Thanks, Pier Vittorio, and thanks actually also, Tipod colleagues, starting from Marson, who is the new me somehow, and, obviously the PhD candidates and all the faculty actually here in Lausanne. So actually, I wanted to start actually from something that happened to me a couple of years ago. I had to sign, in fact, a tenancy agreement where I had to agree to keep the apartment en bon père de famille. This happened actually in Belgium. That's an expression that, that the Francophones actually will know. It means that you are taking care of space properly. Of course, I was, a little bit shocked, almost not about to sign, as you can. Sorry, it's not really going. It's not moving. Yeah. It's actually an expression that has been expunged from legal documents in most, probably all the Francophone contexts. Yet there it was actually staring me in the face. And I found this definition, in fact, actually time and again in architectural texts. For example, here, this is one of the books that we're going to discuss later. And of course, it's a really powerful expression because it really implies patriarchal care, but also the duty of men to actually be a father in the first place, right, and to procreate. But it also makes the care of women, on the other hand, invisible, something that just happens by default. It's really heteronormative, I would say, in the worst possible way. Sorry, I have to figure out how to navigate this. And so actually, this made me think whether creating the father and the mother, so the types, in the case actually of my talk today, was a process that had a spatial counterpart. And if so, whether this process actually was an easy one. You would think it is, because if we see how pervasive, in fact, the nuclear family is, how pervasive the nuclear family apartment is, and these types, like, the mother that we're seeing here, the nanny, the child, and so on and so forth. By the late 1800s, like the period of these paintings that I'm showing here, these were roles that were typecast already and, kind of set in stone and crystallized. But of course, the process was not that simple. And that's why I'm looking at the period that immediately precedes, actually, this moment here portrayed by these paintings. Because for some years now, I have been investigating the way in which the apartment was born as this kind of, series of thresholds of orchestration, basically, of family roles, especially in the 1600s and 1700s. So the early phase when the apartment was not yet a thing. However, now today I want to make a jump forward. In fact, in the late 1700s and 1800s. So at that really bizarre, fragile phase in which actually the apartment was already a thing somehow, and yet no one knew precisely actually what to do with that. And so more or less, we are looking at the 100 years that separate the Encyclopédie at the beginning of the 1700s and Napoleon III. So we go from the Ancien Régime somehow to Haussmann. And I'm looking at 5 books in this case, and these 5 books actually are all, in fact, kind of collections of plans of existing buildings. Apart from one, the kind of central book in the series, the book that kind of corresponds roughly with the French Revolution, which sits in the middle of my periodization and somehow really represents a turning point in more ways than one, actually, as we're going to see. This is the only book, as I said, that it doesn't contain plans for real buildings, but, they are speculative projects, somehow in keeping with the turmoil of the revolutionary and early Napoleonic years. And I really want to use these 5 books for the moment. This is a working process to put forward 5 speculative ideas or theses around the creation of what I would call normalized modern love. By normalized love, I mean monogamous heterosexuality on the one hand and parental love for your biological offspring on the other hand. I really want to make a point that neither has been ever like a universal necessity, and that there's a process that actually casts these 2 types of love as kind of universal and necessary. So the father, the mother, the son, the daughter are all constructed types for me, and they are the types that I want to discuss today. So it's a question of space, but it's also a question really of subjectivity. We all know how well the system worked out for Paul Gauguin himself, in fact, who is both the author and the protagonist of this painting here. Forward. Obviously, in the past few years, materialist feminism has given me, and of course also Pier Vittorio and many of our colleagues, important tools to shed light on what Kate Bush calls this woman's work in her song, which is like literally the bodily work of reproduction. And I would say that really no one understood it better than Manet's wife. She was hired first as his piano teacher, then served as his father's lover, and then she might or might not be portrayed here, in fact, like quite literally as a maid, right? And for many ways, really understanding the way in which this work has been cast as unpaid duty, even a pleasure, or like this ambiguous, paid unpaid situation, and how our domestic architecture really constructed that has been my focus. However, that will not be my focus necessarily today. So what matters for me really tonight is not the work of the woman, but is really this specific work. The idea that there are myriad diseases, all different. And I think the Caillebotte painting here is quite interesting because the more you think about it, the more it's a kind of uncanny image somehow, right? I really don't want to make up today really a genealogy of the way in which the enslavement of both men and women to the nuclear family has happened. I really want to discuss here for a second the frictions. So the spatial devices that resisted the process even for, for a little while, actually. Of course, it was a lost fight, obviously. And just to establish a baseline, here's a glimpse into a kind of relatively wealthy residence as pictured in the mid-1500s by Androuet. That's really one of the very first, actually, examples of printed architectural books in France, probably the first one on domestic space. So the house has a kitchen at the ground floor next to the entrance. It has a chamber, whatever that means, and another hall, the blue one, and a chamber actually on the first floor. Both chambers are marked as cubiculum in Latin for bed chamber. But as you can see, really all the rooms are roughly the same size. They are really large, like 8 by 8 meters, more or less. But this would be really a standard in a wealthy domestic space in continental Europe at the time. And we see it time and again, through contemporary books, most notably probably Serlio's contemporary book on housing. The protagonist actually of my story is the apartment, and it's an evolution of this whole chamber kind of dialectic that we've seen here into a much, much more complex sequence. The apartment is actually both the index for me, but also the generator, in fact, of the family. As defined at the end of the 1600s, actually, by Davila, in the apartment, is a series of rooms composed of antechamber, chamber, and cabinet, sometimes a wardrobe. He makes a point, there are small and large apartments. This I really have to stress because somehow in this analysis today, it's a kind of, inter-class approach where we see that the system can be scaled up, but it's kind of consistent, in fact, actually across classes and scales. The word actually, Davila says, comes from either from the Latin to divide or from because it's subdivided, or from the fact that it's actually just a part of a dwelling unit. So even Davila doesn't exactly know where it comes from. The sequence really only coagulated in the late 1600s. At this moment here, Davila actually writes. We know this, what do we know is, we know this because in fact in the early 1600s, there's a series of treatises that do not show in fact actually apartment systems, this kind of, antechamber, chamber, cabinet system at all until the late 1600s. So it was kind of, coagulated in that century. As we said, that's not a housing unit, that's a part of a house, even of a small house. Now here I'm showing you obviously a very, very large complex example. That's a part of a house that caters to a specific individual or a group or a function or, a seasonal condition, for instance. No link between apartment and family. That's the point that I want to make. This is a really infamous example of how this system can create, crazy complexity, and the antechamber is in purple, the chamber is in red, and the cabinet is in fact actually in orange in this image. That's where I want to start because this project was published in the Encyclopédie in 1752, and that's where kind of the story starts. It starts at the moment where the apartment was already kind of somehow recognized as a type, said very loosely. That's the first thesis that I want to put forward. Mother hasn't always known best, and by this I mean really the idea that women are first and foremost mothers is not a universal concept, and in fact until the 1700s. Wives were rather seen, especially in certain social classes, as business partners, first and foremost. Having or actually bearing children was not equated with parenthood, and parenthood only really started to be romanticized around this time, also for the good reason that, children died like flies, pretty much, right? So you shouldn't get too attached, in fact, actually to your offspring. This understanding of gender roles finds its index for me in a specific space. So each of the theses is kind of associated to a specific space. With the presence of the vestibule, that is basically a kind of negotiating element that sits in between apartments, but outside of the apartment itself. What is interesting to me is that until the mid-1700s, motherhood and fatherhood even less weren't glamorized. One bore children, if they survived, well, you drop them onto someone else. And this happened, in fact, actually across the spectrum, almost in any social layer. Of course, you would just drop them on their, elder siblings, for instance, or on servants and so on and so forth. So the early apartment system really supported these practices by creating this kind of layering of privacy, which was very fluid. And it allowed, in fact, interactions between masters and servants and generations that was, in fact, actually quite, again, fluid throughout the day because of the way the thresholds were organized. My case study actually in this phase is Blondel's collection of existing buildings, very famous French book on French architecture. Blondel tells us that there are no less than 6 kinds of vestibules, which is quite mind-blowing for me, which they stand always actually outside of the house proper said. For instance, in this case, it sits outside of 2 apartment systems perfectly mirrored, antechamber in purple, chamber in red, cabinet in orange. Now, what is amazing here is that the mirroring, which is absolutely specular, really implies actually, I don't want to say gender equality in any sense between husband and wife, but there is a certain sense of balance because one of the 2 apartments would have been for the wife and the other one for the husband. The wife is really a business partner here. Each of them can have conviviality, but also sleeping and working separate from the other. And, they can align in certain moments, but they can also have their set of relationships that are quite independent. Then there are some extra apartments that are dedicated, to special occasions or to other family members. This pattern repeats again and again in literally tens of examples, actually, in the book, with myriad variations, but actually a consistent logic. For instance, here, there's no antechamber, there's just one big salon. It actually happens even in households that are not that wealthy, although, Blondel cases are mostly, in fact, actually aristocratic cases. You can also see quite strikingly, there's no rooms for servants, no rooms for children, in fact. Bedrooms make up a minority of the space, which is striking because that's the contrary of what happens today. The distribution, of course, should be the first task of the architect. Blondel writes that every room should be placed according to the use and it should have a specific shape. However, he preaches that way, but we actually see that in practice it didn't quite work that way because the rooms were in fact actually almost all of them the same size. So there's a kind of budding idea of choreography that is not yet there in practice. So the one thing that is clear is that drawing room or the salon should be the largest room in the house, but then things get completely confused after that. For instance, he talks about antechambers. It's absolutely not clear what they are for. They are used for a variety of purposes. They are a very elastic element. And then he numbers, again, 6 types of chambers, kind of trying to cover kind of all the spectrum. He explains that closets double up as sleeping spaces for the servants. So here's the mystery, of course, is clarified. That's why you don't need, in fact, rooms for the servants. And also gives very, very ample space to the cabinet, which he cannot really define because he wobbles between saying, okay, that's the place where you hoard stuff, but that's also the place where you can find solitude. And in the footnotes, he makes a point. The cabinet is, at the end of the day, a secret place. That's the way he defines it, where you can pray, read, and concentrate on business in intimacy somehow. He also says, at the end of the day, but they are kind of like a bedroom somehow. So you see, he's trying to get very, very precise, but the reality is that the more he tries to define things, the more, the actual reality of things escape him. So the vestibule, which has been incredibly important in this phase, will decay under the pressure of bringing family members closer together into a much tighter, more legible hierarchy. And of course, you can imagine with the vestibule, the first thing that dies away is the mirror role of husband and wife. So next phase, there's a gendering, of course, of the situation. Now, this quote, marriage is the triumph of imagination over intelligence, is often attributed to Oscar Wilde, but that's apocryphal because it's actually a mixture of quotes by other authors. And I would actually say it's also inaccurate because to me, it's rather the other way around. Because actually, I find personally marriage, at this stage at least, a very, very smart political and financial device, which is predicated on the contrary on completely killing any kind of imagination that doesn't conform to the heteronormative, essentially. And the fact that such imagination did exist, in fact, and that it needed to be wiped out to enforce a model is really clearly shown in the gradual evolution of these domestic plans, especially at the end of the Ancien regime. The antechamber would be at the center, really, of this shift. This is like a period that to me is like, endlessly interesting. It's the age of libertinism, which is in fact an intellectual position, whose opponents trivialized as something frivolous, but in fact, actually, which was a very radical declaration of individualism on the one hand and rejection of authority. In particular, I find interesting that libertine thought really played with gender roles right at the moment when those roles were being coagulated. And of course, case in point literature such as Sade and so on and so forth. Here, my case study is a book, quite interesting because it's been made by a publisher, not an architect, not a writer, but a publisher, who collates essentially Xeroxes, a large number of plates from previous books. He was the publisher, in fact, of Blondel's book, from which he stole as well. And but interestingly, because he's stealing, he is treating a number of different social classes in his book. For instance, here he's copying a treatise from the 1730s, which addresses mostly really modest examples, actually. And again, you know, the really pretty ugly colors return, but I hope that that's clear. You have the antechamber again in purple, the chamber in red, and the cabinet in red in orange. So you see, it's a kind of classical sequence, the one that we've seen before. I'm not going to enter into questions of the kitchen and so on and so forth. I just want to focus on the apartment sequence and how it evolves. The same pattern, antechamber, chamber, cabinet, kind of repeats relentlessly. In a number of examples, varying sizes, varying classes, it's kind of almost exactly the same. However, there's a few big differences if we compare this with the previous example. First of all, there's no symmetry, right? So there's no mirroring, which means that actually now there's only one chamber. So there's a really pretty strong gendering of spaces that starts to emerge at this moment. However, the antechamber, this super undefined space, is still there to negotiate these emerging, budding gender frictions somehow. Also, the enfilade that we've seen earlier, so the kind of linear sequence, is folding back into a spiral. Even when they could have space for a symmetrical distribution, this is a rather larger example, in fact, they choose not to replicate the mirror model. So there's a specific choice towards the end of the century, to forget the kind of Rococo mirroring that had more balance between the genders, to go towards a much more asymmetrical, strongly hierarchical model. Labeling also, to me, is super interesting. That's why I'm showing you the actual original documents. It's because it's interesting to see what they say about these rooms. So, for instance, in this case, actually, Jean-Bert is not really sure whether that room that sits in the center at both floors is an antechamber, a vestibule, or a dining room. The salon, in fact, actually was not really a thing at all throughout the 1700s until the end of the century. And actually here we see that that kind of convivial moment is getting a much, much more permanent place in the layout, which didn't really have in fact, throughout the century. So the antechamber will soon disappear to leave its place actually to a dining room, in fact, what we still have today. Increasingly, we also see something else interesting. You see the antechamber is switching place. So it's now in the middle between chamber and cabinet. So you see this kind of sequence of privacy that we've seen earlier. It's kind of disrupted because the antechamber gets in between cabinet and chamber. The chamber would have probably been the domain of the wife, the cabinet of the husband, of course, then, right? And then we have wardrobes to the back of the chamber, and that's probably the place where the servants and the children would have been. That, to me, really suggests some motherification somehow of the woman who is then in proximity with the spaces used by the servants and the children. This is really the stage in which actually furniture starts to become much more permanent, much more specifically built for particular rooms, and then the unprogrammed antechamber gradually is transformed into dining rooms, entrance halls, and salons. So exit the antechamber. And this is three. Is that ultimately you should love yourself much more than your neighbor, especially I would say if the neighbor is your spouse. And the special element that exemplifies, for me, this kind of rise of self-care is the cabinet, which has been already kind of a protagonist of the previous examples, but really gets a completely new meaning at this point. And we are now tackling, the kind of, decade around the French Revolution. An image like this really would have been unthinkable, I would say, a generation earlier. This is from, the Napoleonic period, more or less. But conjugal love is really a completely bourgeois invention, and the revolution really elevated bourgeois ethos to the norm, in fact. It's actually said that the Moulin couple were the first couple in Paris to sleep together in a particularly large bed, and their mutual affection, of course, is now the stuff of legends, of course. After the revolution, however, exactly that ethos became the norm, and marriage ceased to be a business transaction between those who have property to leave to their heirs. It becomes a matter of love. So it becomes actually a right for everyone, of course, as long as you're heterosexual. So we see how now here this husband caressing his heavily pregnant wife. I'm totally not sure if the artist is somehow trolling us, because there's a rather creepy expression, I have to say, on the face of the husband. But either way, I have to say it's, there's something quite disturbing to me in this image. But I think it's historically interesting that this kind of moment of conjugal bliss or tenderness, in fact, in the original French, is portrayed at this moment in time as the new normal, which really would have, I think, disgusted actually, especially the highest layers of society just a generation before. So here I want to look at Dubout, who is interesting because he's a pupil of Ledoux, on really the cusp of the Napoleonic era, right before actually he crowned himself emperor. He publishes a treatise which really mixed a kind of Durand-Ledoux proto-rationalist approach with a drastic reformation of family roles. So these are all speculative projects. These two labeled as houses for a bachelor or small family. And now at this point, I have to make another disclaimer. Just as much as the size and the class in a way of the dwelling in this specific context of what I'm showing you right now, I don't think are so important. I'm also not so interested in the way that the envelope in this moment actually reacts to the interior. So some of the examples that I will show you from now on will be detached houses and some are apartments. What matters really to me is the way in which the different pièces or the different rooms of the house relate to each other. And so these two projects labeled as houses for a bachelor or small family are quite amazing from a couple of points of view. First of all, public and private are completely separated, right? So there's no gradient anymore. There's either public, that is actually the bottom floor, or private, that is the top floor. In the private part, the spouses are meant to sleep together. There's just one bedroom, just one bed. But interestingly, you can see that it's actually quite unclear if the cabinet is still a private affair or has rather migrated towards the public part, because there's also a cabinet close to the living room. There are themes actually that Dubout follows in all of his examples, regardless of size, regardless of the fact that the house is a detached house or it's actually a townhouse, in fact. For instance, here in this case, we see a kind of pretty, I would say, a masterclass in splitting. We have the service to the back with the kitchen, servants, and an extra room, probably for the children. And then to the front, we have public to the left and private to the right. And I think it's quite striking that it's exactly the same kind of logic that Sophie was showing us actually earlier today in the apartments that she was criticizing, right? So it was exactly, I mean, at that moment that this emerged, and we see, the bedroom and the cabinet to the right, and the dining and the living, in fact, actually to the left. There's no symmetry anymore. There's no cabinet for the lady. It's only the man actually who has a cabinet at this point. And he need a cabinet. Boy, does he need that, because actually the fashion of conjugal love had pushed the spouses to share the same room, a solution that, to be honest, not that many people enjoyed necessarily. So what we witness here is that the cabinet is leached gradually of that purpose of self-care, and it drifts towards the public part of the house, right? It drifts like, asunder from the chamber until it becomes basically a home office, I would say, just for the men, of course. Fourth thesis, love did tear them apart and does tear us apart still today, the boudoir. So bourgeois conjugal law, we were saying, emerged really a little bit before the revolution, obviously, in the mid-1700s, I would say, right at the time when cabinets and boudoir become a part of the apartment system. However, this word appeared in literature like almost a century before it landed on architectural material. Architects were super reluctant to use this word. They really hated it. And in fact, actually, architects time and again, throughout the 1700s, labeled boudoirs as cabinets. They found the idea of a space to sulk, because that's obviously the meaning of the word boudoir, rather undignified. And I would agree, because I think it had a really misogynist connotation somehow. The woman needs to go brood somewhere, essentially, right? Men had cabinets for intellectual pursuits, such as study, business, prayer. Women had boudoir to prettify, essentially, and to have affairs, obviously. So this was a deliberate attempt, I think, to delegitimate the fact that in the 1700s, French women had been really increasingly educated. Particularly, the 1700s are the century of the boom of the novel. The novel is somehow the genre that brings literacy to women somehow. So there's a whole new generation of women who have learned how to read silently. Now, this for us is obvious, but I mean, the idea that now women can read without even moving their lips, so you don't know what goes on in their mind when they're reading, is kind of mind-blowing to these generations, actually, of men. So then we have to delegitimize the boudoir. In fact, I think that they were spaces of pleasure, for sure. But I think that this pleasure was very often far less carnal than the patriarchal view would have us believe. And I think we have traces of that, of course, also in paintings and so on and so forth. Here I looked at a published book where the boudoir is on its way out, so in the 1830s, but it's starting to be labeled because it's kind of, at least entered the norm of what is socially accepted. Even the cabinet is hanging on by a thread, I would say. Here, Normand does something that I think is very interesting. He labels cabinet, a space that opens on the salon. So the blue is the salon, the yellow or orange is the cabinet. So you see that the space of the husband opens on the salon. However, he labels boudoir, the pink thing next to the bedroom. So he's clearly gendering that the boudoir is very private and it's actually feminine. So this case is also very similar. You see that the boudoir is tucked behind the farthest room there. It's a pink one. I mean, subconsciously, I put it in pink, completely confusing, or not so subconsciously, confusing cabinet and boudoir. Actually, he's not really sure if the orange one is a cabinet or a boudoir. So it really shows that 100 years in, they haven't really decided actually what is what. It's a very much a story about labeling, what I'm showing you, but I think labels are somehow important. Also here you can see there's lots more bedrooms than in far grander examples that we've seen before. We started from a far rather big, grand example with just 2 bedrooms, and actually here we have 4 in a much, much tighter, in fact, situation. You also see that the comble or the attic, in fact, has become a place for the servants to sleep. So the servants are not sleeping close to the masters anymore. Actually, they are kind of, ejected from the house and they have their own space. Whether this is good or not, it can be a subject of discussion. And of course, conjugal love is normalized. Sleeping together becomes almost the rule, though not quite. But paradoxically, the plan becomes actually much more gendered, because very often you get, in fact, a smaller room labeled as kids' room. That's the yellow one. You cannot see the label, but it says basically kids' room, attached to one of the 2 bedrooms, which is then clearly the room of the wife that is, again, motherized somehow. When possible, the cabinet is far from all that, is far from crying children, all those things. At the bottom floor, for instance, that's cabinet d'études there, that is the bureau office, basically, of the husband. So the boudoir had emerged as a middle-class kind of moralistic view of what aristocracy simply called a cabinet, right? Late 1700s authors could hate on this space for female autonomy, I would say, or for pleasure. However, they had to admit it existed. Dubut simply erased it in the revolutionary period, but the post-revolutionary sensibility, actually, we're now at Normand. He's not trying to make a point, he's simply collecting examples, and he registers that, yeah, the boudoir is kind of there, but it's on its way to be turned into a nursery somehow. Last thesis. I'm at the end of the story. Everyone has a type, and obviously this is ironic. And what I mean, obviously, I really don't think that any of us really has a type, but that's what the apartment would have us believe, right? This happens actually around the mid-1800s, when the basic dwelling unit is redefined as an apartment. So, the apartment that was a part of a house becomes the house, and the components are set. Funnily enough, the clarification of the apartment type is actually both the apotheosis, but also the end of the closet. The closet had been a proper room, like a wardrobe, an actual space on the plans. Here it disappears, but paradoxically, it kicks back again, actually, in the form of furniture. And the purpose and the choreography of each room are now kind of set, and the furniture enforces them. It's actually perhaps less of a story about architectural layout and more about labeling and furnishing rooms. So we are during the Second Empire, at the end of the Second Empire, full-on Haussmann period. Léonce Reynaud actually says that every room should have attached to it a smaller service room. This seems to follow the principle of dedoubling that we've seen earlier. However, if we read what he says, service spaces are really only storage. So there's a thinning out of this kind of in-between spaces. So now, and here actually completely absent from actual examples, as I was saying. I mean, this is, for instance, a case of 2 apartments, very typical of Haussmannian building. Zooming in, the one on the street contains a double salon, that's the blue one, and then 4 bedrooms in red and a dining in green. I think we can agree it's kind of a contemporary distribution. It's very similar to the way we live today. The one to the back is exactly the same. In fact, there's no vestibule, no antechamber, no cabinet, no nothing. Same happens here, a double salon facing a dining room and a series of bedrooms, in both cases. So you see that the circulation has changed. The disproportion between room sizes has also changed, and a lot of the colors that we've seen, before are out of the picture. Vestibules and antechambers, he says, are just passages that lead somewhere else, and in fact they've disappeared. Now the rooms of the house should open onto other spaces, so the enfilade has also disappeared, and all rooms are endpoints somehow. And by 1870, Renaud could say with total certainty that the dwelling is now divided into three parts: public, private, and service. Guess where he places the cabinet? In the public part of the house. In fact, actually, he keeps listing spaces such as cabinet and boudoir, which he talks about, but they are not in the plans that he shows, even in very large apartments, I should say. There's still the usual hate for the boudoir, but it really feels that there's no more vim or vigor to this condemnation, because he knows that if you want to go sulk, you should now really quite literally go back into a closet. So what was once a room has now become a piece of furniture. However, the story is not linear, clearly, right? In 1884, Havard actually wrote that English and French homes each have a special idiosyncratic room that doesn't happen in any other context. The English have the nursery, the French have the boudoir. And he says, having to choose, I have no doubt what I and you, reader, would choose. Which I realized would have made a very good close to my presentation, which is basically there, but I just had it today at lunch, I must add, actually, this rather, ugly diagram, but that's just to say, we go from an enfilade to this kind of, circular spiral kind of situation, to a situation in which we have a double circulation to the corridor and to a peripheral doors to this kind of, constellation type of, circulation that we have still today in contemporary apartments. So that's kind of the story that I'm trying to tell. We are at the end of the story. We are basically in my apartment today, in your apartment, in the apartments that we design. An apartment that is made of bedrooms and closets instead of antechambers and boudoir. An apartment where love is work, where love is not only this woman's work, but is, your work as well. Where love is either conjugal or filial, or it isn't, in fact. It's an apartment where friendship, conviviality, play, self-care, pleasure, sensuality, intellectual commitment have all been harnessed into really this kind of mechanism of reproduction. That's why I think it's worth remembering that we once had vestibules, antechambers, cabinets, nurseries, libraries, fumoirs, cartonniers, billiard rooms, wardrobes, and I have to say, especially boudoir. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Of course, it was a very, very interesting presentation. And of course, knowing your work, especially you have focused especially on French architecture, which is, I know it's an interest that you have not only actually in terms of domestic space, but in French culture in general, especially art, painting. And actually, I want you to maybe elaborate on how you use these paintings. Especially the work of Fragonard, I think is, I know it's something, is a painter you like a lot. So maybe if you can elaborate on the use of painting as a sort of evidence for your research.
I think this is a very, you're putting on the table, I think, two very interesting questions for me. So on the one hand, the interest that I have for France, but particularly for Paris, I would say, and on the other hand, actually the visual evidence. Maybe starting from the Paris thing. I should add a footnote because you started from that. I kind of arrived at this material not looking at the apartment, but looking at the facades. So on purpose, I'm not showing you any facades right now, but for a long time, I was looking at, maybe not exactly these books, but French treatises as a way to trace genealogies of urban spaces actually through the facade. And I always found these plans very uninspiring. I was really not interested in the plans, right? Because I took them for granted. And at a certain moment, there was kind of a Copernican revolution when I was like, okay, let's look at the plans, actually. Let's look at this thing that seems so unattractive somehow to me at the beginning, right? And I started to find actually these really bizarre names of rooms that we don't use anymore. I started to find them even in apartments that were not so large, in fact. So to me, that connection between inside and outside are almost like two different moments of my interest for this material. And then the question of the paintings, it's a funny one because I have no training in art at all. I was trained as a commercial architect, and I'm not even really sure that I understand art, to be completely fair. But we need to have somehow an idea of the subjectivity that is put in, somehow in relationship with these super dry plants, right? With things like, like even this text, because of course it's about really, things like this, for instance, right? So I am actually not really sure how to answer your question, but for one thing, that I kind of, grew up thinking that these paintings were very sentimental, were very frivolous, and so on and so forth. And at a certain moment, I had actually to kind of, self-analyze myself. I mean, what is it that we find actually so disturbing about these paintings? The fact that they are kind of not serious, quote unquote. In fact, they are extremely serious. In fact, they take seriously a series of life categories that today we don't. So, I mean, all of a sudden, then it got interesting to me to see, how did we get actually to consider certain categories of life, like, for instance, play, play or pleasure, as categories that are in fact actually negative. So that's why, for me, the use of these paintings, especially the ones from 1700, so I would say Watteau, Fragonard, and Boucher, are particularly interesting because they're kind of also not so fashionable anymore
and also
today.
Because in a way they are really the ancien regime painters. Yeah. I mean, they are the painters that will be hated by David, by the artist of the French Revolution. That will be artists that will really focus on public space, on historic painting. And now maybe the only image of intimacy coming from the French Revolution is the death of Marat, just because he happens to die on a bathtub. But basically, in a way, you use a work of ancien regime that will be swept away from the French Revolution.
I think there's something that is interesting in the ancien regime in general, because the revolution has not been good for all subjects. And I must add that, in fact, in the case of women particularly, it has, under some respects, been very problematic, I have to say.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I also have a question regarding the balance between architecture as evidence and architecture as agent in your presentation. So I think it's amazing how you use painting and plan. Again, architecture as a sensor that measures a lot of processes, and we can, by delucidating the mechanisms of these plans, we can unpack a number of dynamics like the ones you described. But I think they're mirroring also things that are happening outside of
completely,
right. So then my question is, because I know we all have to be affirmative because we believe in architecture. So we say it's not only a sensor, it has to have an agency. So when you finish your presentation, say, okay, we should have more boudoirs and antechambers. The question is, to what degree do you attach architecture agency? Or if we were to integrate today, this, of course, is a bit rhetorical question, but it's the question to what degree architecture is agent in mobilizing those changes, or to what degree architecture is the sensor that help us understand them.
Completely. I think that this is a super important, for me, it's maybe actually the question. And there's a twofold answer to me. There is us today and these guys actually back then. Maybe, starting from those guys back then. I mean, it's pretty clear, especially when you go to the text. And of course, there's no time now to read them, but I put them up because I just think they are interesting. It's pretty clear that in some cases they didn't really have a clear idea of what they were doing, right? They were just kind of, tentatively trying, to construct a grammar for themselves. However, if I want to be both in a way, to give them more importance actually than I give them throughout the presentation, but also be a little bit more cynical, I think that they were agents of a change and not for the good. And particularly these cases of the Haussmannian apartment, I think, for instance, in Renault's case, his view of the family, for instance, is extremely heteronormative, much more than Blondel, let's say, 100 years before. So from his point of view, he had agency. He thought that was the right thing to do. He thought that it was actually really cool that we have like a double salon, but the woman has no space, for instance. So I think that, if I think about that, it doesn't give me a lot of faith in humankind, but it gives me a lot of faith in architecture, because they were kind of aware of the fact that what they were doing was manipulating Morse. For instance, the fact that for a long time they didn't want to label that room boudoir, even if they made it in actual fact, I think it's really symptomatic. They were like, no, we are kind of resisting this kind of rather undignified space. They even say it, I mean, of course, again, it's in the text, this is undignified, we shouldn't be working with that. But so it was there literally in novels and so on and so forth, but architects actually did retain some kind of agency. Obviously, the thing is that I don't think it was agency for the good back then, no? The second part of the story is actually what about us today? And to me, this is really the driver, because in all of this wrestling with these archival sources, for me, there were really two aspects of that. The first is more like this curiosity that I started by looking at facades and then I switched to the interior. But the second has to do with the fact that I was an architect in practice actually for a while, working mostly on commercial developments of domestic space, kind of, middle income, I would say, not necessarily low income, not, it's like, the kind of average situation. And I was always on autopilot. It's like, of course, when you draw, I mean, I already have in mind the fact that you need actually a grid of columns that needs to fit, cars, because there's going to be a parking lot at the bottom. Then there's, certain number of rooms. Then you need to have a kitchen. The kitchen has a certain relationship with the entrance because you want to enter and leave actually your stuff immediately to the kitchen. And then at a certain moment, you read these historical sources and you're like, in history, sometimes they had completely different parameters and completely different priorities. Like, for instance, something that I cut out because there's no time. There's almost no relationship between dining room and kitchen until almost yesterday, pretty much, actually. So there were that was not a priority somehow, right? Because they had servants, but also because they ate a different type of food. So they didn't have our idea of like, freshness of food and so on and so forth. So to me, then the question of looking back at history is not that I think I will ever have a chance to design a house with a fumoir, although, my father is a smoker, so I think if I will ever build a house for my parents, it's like, yes, I'm sold. But it's just that it really, for me as a designer and also as a teacher, because this question was asked earlier today, is important because it kind of, liberates us from the idea that every apartment has to look exactly the same, because it hasn't always looked the same. So I guess it's at that level, even just the naming. Maybe we should just start to call rooms differently, because a lot of what they did was labeling at the end of the day. It was not really the thing. It's like how you talk about it. So.
Thanks. Don. Yeah. Thanks very much, Maria. Yeah, it was a really, really illuminating study that you did. I think, one thing that was coming to my mind is, despite everything seeming to sort of dissolve in where we are now, everything seems to be relationships, norms, et cetera, there's still this hyper normativity to the way that we imagine daily life somehow, so or housing and relationships, et cetera. So something really interesting that I saw through the way that you were composing the series of studies is really this point that has come up a few times during the course of the presentations, which is nothing is stable, yet nothing becomes.
Yeah.
Because, there's something really interesting about as the house becomes more specific and more somehow tries to kind of shell and tries to create separations. And one moment it creates, it tries to produce a certain type, which creates the conflict that we have against that type. So we're constantly conflicted by that, by that production. So I think the idea of imagination is a really crucial one. And maybe the last suggestion you're making about even changing the names of the room, there's a Japanese architect who actually names the entire house a bathroom and tiles the entire house as a bathroom.
Amazing.
Yeah, really. And so no, I just wonder, I think it raises some really important questions about how we might open that imagination. And it's really crazy that, as you know, I went and stayed with a commune in Japan, a farming cooperative for a while, where women are not mothers, men are not fathers, children are not children. It's and I came back the day I flew back to London. I heard in Terrace Victorian apartment, I heard a kid crying all day, and I didn't hear a single child cry the entire time in the Japanese cooperative. So, and at that moment, I realized that these kind of, you know, with the level we interrogate things, how much we inherit so much these,
Completely.
and we suffer because of it somehow. So yeah, I think that a question of how to open the imagination it's a quite tricky one. Yeah. But
thanks, Brandon. I know that we have to go forward actually with the Fredo presentation, but I just want to say one quick thing because to tie back with what Thiago was showing us actually yesterday morning. I mean, I don't have an answer. I think it's like, you know, but one thing that I find interesting for myself working with my students is starting to look at rooms. I don't even know the word room is also problematic, but let's say whatever, from an environmental point of view, because in fact, that's what we can also learn from history. So, I should have said, in many cases, in fact, those apartments were used seasonally, for instance, or in terms of wanting a place that was more silent or more, you know, or less silent and so on and so forth. So I think maybe this is like a very basic way, at least as teachers, to start from these very basic qualities, like, you know, noisy and quiet, you know, bright and dark and so on and so forth. It's a basic trick, but for the moment, at least as a teacher, that's the most basic trick up my sleeve. And of course, the second one is looking into these you know, by now unfashionable things, unfashionable rooms, but also unfashionable art, perhaps.